Alright YouTube, it's time for a more upbeat video, because I know some of it lately has been all Ebola and stuff. I promised another occult video, so I figured that I made one about like cryptids in general, like the paranormal, but I wanted to make one specifically about lake and sea monsters, specifically aquatic cryptids, and to share some of my thoughts on that. First, if you can find this book, Lake Monster Traditions: A Cross-Cultural Analysis by Michael Murger and Claude Gagnon, it is the best book written on the subject. I mean, how many friggin' pages? 320 pages, extensive footnotes, lots of illustrations. The number of specific cases that it covers is vast. You can't get a better book with regards specifically to especially Canada and the United States. On the topic. Takes a lot of these stories take place in French Canada, New England, but they are spread out further. It does go into detail about other cultures as well. It's written from an anthropological perspective. You can get it on Amazon, by the way. I believe it's also on eBay. There may be a website for it. I haven't checked. But it's written from an anthropological background. That is, it is a skeptical work. It doesn't assume the existence of these creatures. But insofar as it lists so many different varieties of them, so many hundreds of different actual stories and creatures, there's interviews and everything. As far as using it as a sort of field guide to further research, it's unmistakably the best. Now, as a skeptical guide, it does tend to draw stereotypes about lake monsters because it assumes that they probably do not exist, although it doesn't go into specific detail trying to refute things. It's attempting to boil down, literally in a cross-cultural manner, it's attempting to boil down aquatic cryptids into sort of groups and traditions, literally lake monster traditions, like native lore and so forth. For instance, it posits that there are several major forms that are described when people have encounters with what they believe are these cryptids. The floating log is one, the seal, the horse's head, the big fish, and so forth. But again, you can't get a better book on the subject. It's comprehensive beyond words. My own thoughts on aquatic cryptids, specifically lake, sea monsters, and things like that. I will take issue with this work and similar works, whether skeptical or purely academic. This one's more on the academic end while being skeptical. I will take issue with the tendency to dismiss all reports of a specific life form said to dwell in a specific location as one phenomenon. That is, like in this work at some points, it attempts to explain, for instance, the floating log phenomenon is most common on lakes which once had extensive lumber works nearby. Essentially, that there were floating logs, and maybe occasionally these logs come to the surface and people think it's a sea monster or something. I take issue with that. I prefer to believe that when there are sightings of a cryptid, part of it is hype, hoax. There will be hoaxes, there will be hype, as in someone literally does see a floating log and thinks it's a lake monster. That is clear. For instance, I believe that there is some sort of cryptid living in Lake Champlain. It's a vast lake. There are parts of it that are extremely deep. It is entirely possible that a small population of some large sort of lake animal is living there. It is possible. There is enough room. There are enough resources. Parts of the lake are sparsely populated near the edge, so it's entirely possible. However, even if I assume that that cryptid exists, most of the sightings, or at least some of them, are hoaxes. They are hype. They are floating logs and lake sturgeon and so forth. Because a tourist comes up, sees an 8-foot-long lake sturgeon sunning itself, of course they're going to think it's a sea monster. They're coming here, they think that fish are this long. They think that it's all like brook trout and things like that. Naturally, they see this gigantic fish, and it surprises them so much that psychologically, later on, when they find out there actually are, regular sturgeon living there that are that large, they say, well, this was actually 20 feet long or 15 feet long or something. Can't have been one of those, even though it actually was. However, on the opposite side, if there is no animal, specifically no cryptid life form in a given lake or something, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are all seeing the same type of, you could call it fake phenomenon. It's not really fake, it's just misunderstanding what you're seeing. To boil down all sightings of Champ as being a floating log is clearly wrong. Some of them are sturgeon, some of them are other life forms, some of it might be a moose literally walking through a swampy area with only its head sticking out. Maybe its horns fell off or got chopped off or something, and so it looks like a horse's head sort of serpent with its tail sticking up and back. And people say, well, it's a lake monster. Well, no, it's a moose, but it's also not a floating log. It's also not a seal. It's not a hoax. It's an actual life form that somebody sees and they ascribe it to a lake monster. I believe that at least a small minority of the cases around the world where people talk about there being strange things living in their lakes are not just hype. They are not just Indian legends that have been modernized. They're not just hoaxes. They're not just anything like that. They are genuine encounters with some sort of life form that is either out of place or which has achieved unusually large or strange proportions. For instance, in Lake Champlain, it was once connected to the ocean. The idea that it could have gone from largely a saltwater body to a brackish body and then to a freshwater body over the course of many thousands and thousands of years is there. The possibility that aquatic life forms normally adjusted to seawater had slowly evolved and become capable of surviving in a freshwater habitat exists as well. It is seen in nature. There are sharks living there. I can't remember the lake. There is a lake in South America with a variety of shark in it. Normally a seafaring creature. They have adapted to fresh water over the course of many, many millions of years. And if you were to tell somebody before they understood that this was the fact, that the lake had sharks in it, if that wasn't known until the modern period, then people would be looking at that and saying it's a hoax, or it's a story meant to frighten children, to keep them, do your chores, don't go in the lake, because there's sharks in there or something. And there are situations where that happens. But we know that they actually exist. Science has quantified them, judged them to be real based on the evidence, because we've got footage of them, we've got pictures of them, people have seen them firsthand. They do exist. The fact is, though, that in a lake like Lake Champlain, or some of these other bodies of water, the Great Lakes and so forth, the amount of territory there is vast, hundreds of square miles in some cases, sometimes more. You look at some of the Great Lakes, look at how large they are. The size of entire states you can't even see from one side to the other. How can you say for sure? It's okay to be skeptical, but how can you say for sure that some Indian legend about a specific being that lives there that has, it's a 20-foot long fish isn't true? How do you know that there isn't the occasional lake sturgeon that does achieve such a size? Therefore, it is technically a cryptid. You could quantify it scientifically, but if there's only one that's grown to that proportion, its genetics got fucked up somehow and it has double the lifespan for some reason. Or it simply just got huge. Maybe it has cancer or something. It's got a huge ass tumor right on its back and yet persists, survives, and thrives despite it. The fact is, it might be a creature that is unique. It might be one specific life form that accounts for some of those sightings. I believe, again, there is something, I believe, in Lake Champlain. I have seen enough video footage. I have seen enough documentation to believe that something is living in that lake, and I don't claim it's a cryptid. I claim that it's a small population of some sort of creature that people are seeing, at least from time to time, when you get rid of the hoaxes and misidentification. I choose to believe that there is something that is not yet quantified living in the lake. There are all sorts of weird things in that lake. There's fucking sunken ships and all sorts of stuff there. In the ocean, it's the same. The ocean, it's even more vast. There's more seawater on the surface of this planet than there is land. We have mapped a very small percentage of it in any detail. A few miles offshore, it's basically uncharted territory. Some of these areas are astoundingly deep. We haven't explored most of the deep ocean. Until fairly recently, the idea of real giant squid, we're not talking about an 8-foot Humboldt or, the occasional 20-foot specimen. Until fairly recently, we assumed that that was fancy, that tails of squid that were as large as ships were hokum, they were bunk, they didn't actually exist, until they started washing up. Because the last time that these things washed up in any great numbers was before science hit modernity. They didn't have the ability to really document what they were seeing, and even if they wrote about it, people in the modern era, modern scientists, aren't going to trust what even a respectable individual said 100 years ago. They will assume, because they don't see it themselves, that it's not true. But we now know these squid do exist. We've seen video footage of them under the water. We've seen at least smaller sized specimens wash up ashore. We've seen the marks on whales where they've gotten into tangles with these squid. Some of them are probably literally 100 feet long from the edge of their tentacles to the top of their head. But if you had told somebody that 20 years ago, they would have said that you were into cryptozoology. Now they would say that you're into simply science. And there's the distinction. With things, and it goes to terrestrial things as well. Anything like Bigfoot or any of these things, they're normally, for instance with Bigfoot, the area in which the early and pluritude of sightings occurred is deep in British Columbia and parts of the Pacific Northwest. Areas that are remote, areas that are extremely mountainous, areas that are largely unsettled. Some of these mountain ranges still, to this day, they have very few people living in them. The sightings that have happened outside of that region, probably for the most part, are misidentification of bears, people playing tricks. In the case of like the skunk ape, probably people are seeing an escaped gorilla because it's Florida after all. It's invasive species 101 for anyone who's into that sort of thing. But as far as those original sightings, which go literally back into antiquity, into Mesoamerican culture, you can't simply say that every single sighting is a misidentification of a grizzly bear, or a misidentification of some other animal, or a hallucination. Yeah, I defy that could possibly be true. These could be some species that only lives in this one remote range in caves that have been seldom, if ever, explored. Nobody would have a clue because they simply don't penetrate the woods on that regular basis. The same is true of these bodies of water. We are terrestrial mammals. We are not suited to aquatic life. We spend relatively little time in the water. Whether it happens to be a small brook or the open ocean, we spend very little time in these areas. Now, the mythical, the sort of mythical feel of things like, oh, it's an Indian curse, it's a unique, fantastic creature. It's sort of the dragons and unicorns. I defy that equally as well. I don't think that there are dragons slumbering at the bottoms of these lakes that cause earthquakes or any of these sort of legends that people concoct. But to say that there's nothing there when the area hasn't been adequately explored by science or by anybody else in many cases is a preposterous notion. You've got to understand, some of these lakes in the far north are remote. There might be one village on its shores, everyone else lives away from the water, or it might be a tourist location that 90% of the year is virtually abandoned. Well then, who's going to see that there's actually a 20-foot long sturgeon living in the lake? Who's to say there isn't a 10-foot long northern pike? Who's to say there isn't a muskie that has achieved some great size, or any of these other fish? It's like the Chinese salamanders, these enormous amphibians that get 8 fucking feet long and dredge about in these swamps in China. Until recently, they assumed that sightings of one of these particular specimens that is of massive size, in one little body of water, I believe near one of their imperial palaces, they thought it was bunk. They now know it's real. It actually exists. It could have been the basis for every dragon legend. These lizards are almost the size of a Komodo dragon, and science hadn't largely quantified them. They knew that there were large salamanders living in China, just as I've seen a foot-long salamander out in the brook behind my home. I've seen weird creatures that I couldn't explain before when I was a child. I saw some sort of creature. I don't know exactly what it was. I've tried in vain to find what it was. The closest thing I can find is a crane fly larva. Now, a crane fly larva would be hard pressed to be 2 inches long. This one was almost half a foot long. I don't want to know what kind of insect larva I actually had in my hands that day. It was real. Do I claim to know what it is? No. Do I claim that it's mystical and that was a special day when I was blessed by a unicorn offspring? No. But it was real. I saw it with my own eyes. I held it with my own hands. If I had had a camera at the time, I would have photographed it, and people would know that what I was saying was true. But because I don't have a photograph, and because I'm not a PhD, people probably wouldn't really take that seriously. They would say I overestimated the size because I happened to be smaller at the time. I think I remember, what size my childlike hands were, but they can claim that. But there are all sorts of weird creatures in this world that probably are rare, or very shy, or both in some cases. Bigfoot has been posited to be perhaps some species of hominid that simply prefers not to interact with what it perceives as other intelligent creatures, fearing danger. And possibly something that lives only in very remote locations, in very small numbers. Perhaps it would qualify as a threatened species, essentially. Take a walk through Africa, and your odds of seeing a white rhino are virtually nil. They exist, they've been quantified by science, but I think there's only about 10 of them left in the wild on the face of the earth. So you could explore the entire region of Africa and probably never see one. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. It's like the Tasmanian tiger. Fairly recently, there have been a handful of sightings of a being that is supposedly and could possibly be members of a remnant, a very small population of this supposedly extinct animal. It is possible that that's the case. It's also possible they're seeing something else, like feral dogs, and they wouldn't really know. Or it could be a hybrid between the Tasmanian tiger and some other species, for all anyone knows. But it possibly exists, and unless you scour the entire region from top to bottom repeatedly, you can't say for sure that it's not there. The same holds true, again, with any being that is posited to be in the open ocean, in specifically large lakes. This is why I discount largely. I would like to believe that Nessie exists, but I don't believe there's a Nessie. My rationale is that Loch Ness is not a particularly large body of water, and the fame of the legend is so great that there are people watching it virtually all the time. There are actually live webcams set up on Loch Ness on a 24/7 basis. The fact that nobody has gotten more than the grainiest of footage or photographs tells me it's unlikely. Still not impossible. For all I know, it could be a species that hibernates for 50 years at a time, but less likely. Whereas with Champ, we do have actual fairly decent video footage not taken that long ago of something in the lake that appears to be quite large, where we do have objects in the background and foreground for comparison, and it's probably about 15 feet long. Well, my own personal belief, I'll give this as the one specific example. I believe that Champ is actually a population of sea sturgeons, which reach much larger sizes. I believe maybe they're interbreeding with the lake sturgeons, no real way to tell. It would be a small population because of their great size, and they would have adapted to freshwater. It's not a fantastic being, it's simply one that exists in a small, relatively small remnant population, only occasionally being seen, with a lot of hoaxes and a lot of misidentification thrown in. And that's my take on most of these things. If I've never been there, I can't say for sure it doesn't exist. I choose to believe that people living 100 years ago or more weren't dumb. They weren't all superstitious brutes. The Native Americans had their superstitions, but does that mean that every time that they claim to have seen an ape man, or a legendary white bear, or a white buffalo or anything, that they were wrong? No, of course not. They probably did see these things, at least on occasion. Some of it probably is hallucination. Some of it is misidentification, but to chalk all of the sightings up to the same exact phenomenon, whether the assumption is it's a specific creature or not, I think goes beyond the realm of logic into trying to simply categorize and group things. Humans have a tendency to try to put things in little categories so that they can understand them more easily. It's much easier to say every sighting of Champ is a floating log than to admit that maybe 1% of those sightings are actually some sort of sea sturgeon that somehow got locked into Lake Champlain and now is capable of growing 20 feet long. And to tell the truth, a lot of people who do see such things, who do think that they've seen something mythical or fantastic or legendary or out of the ordinary, will shut up and say nothing. They will never admit to what they saw because they don't want to be ridiculed. This book actually goes into detail about that. There are cases where people have said that they've seen something, but under pressure from local media or something else, they will then stop talking about it. And if they do, they will attempt to rationalize it. They'll say, well, yeah, I thought I saw something, but it was actually, in hindsight, is probably just a floating log. And another thing that it points out is there's the tendency to try to modernize the story. When people are trying to sort of excuse what they've seen, they'll go from, well, I saw this legendary fish that the Indians used to see, to, well, I saw an abnormally large sturgeon, this lake must have been part of the ocean at one time, sort of the modernist approach, and in the postmodern, well, maybe someone was playing a hoax with a fucking submarine. And you see this progression over time of these stories, which shouldn't tell us that they're fake. It just says that there's ridicule going on and that people don't want to talk about it. I'm open about such things because I have a great interest in them. I don't give a damn what anyone thinks about my beliefs, and I know that there are others that think that way. Unfortunately, because I delve into that sort of material anyway, people would tend to discount my opinion as fantastic. They would assume that I was superstitious. I may not be, but that would be the assumption. He's wearing the pentagram, he's talking about lake monsters in the occult. He probably saw nothing. He's either making it up or he's, driving himself into a frenzy, trying to explain the log that he just saw. And that happens a lot as well. Even when you have reliable witnesses, you're talking chiefs of police, statesmen, governors, and so forth. Look at the Bell Witch case. Thomas Jefferson took a vacation down to observe the Bell Witch and was apparently compelled by what he saw. Does that mean it's not a hoax? No. Does it mean something bizarre was going on, whether it's a hoax, actual possession in the occult at work, or, squirrels in the walls? Makes no difference. Something happened. We have it on record by reputable witnesses that something happened, including Thomas Jefferson, which I think is probably would qualify as a reputable witness. Actually, it may have been Washington. One of the presidents, before or after they were the actual president, did go down to see that. I think it was Jefferson. It could have been one of these other early presidents, but let's look at it this way. To chalk up all the sightings of a specific lake monster in a specific location as being all of the same variety, either a hoax or a floating log or whatever, I think is wrong. I think that you need to investigate, where possible, individual accounts. I would say this holds true with Bigfoot, this holds true with the occult, this holds true with everything. That's the rational way to go about it. You can't simply group together all sightings and explain it away as urban myth. Because in many cases, it's not an urban myth. The myth, so-called, goes back centuries, sometimes thousands of years, to pre-colonial contact. In those cases, it's a lot harder to simply say there's nothing there. But yeah, there's just an occult video about lake monsters in specific. Got a little off topic, but whatever. You have to drag other things in. That's about all. Peace out.